Narosi, kilometer 21. The Gare national, Narosi, the Kandu City. This is a court to do, this is a put city.
Captured on camera here, the Tunisian National Guard attacked a refugee camp near the country's coast earlier today. Residents report goods being stolen and shelters set ablaze by an armed force the EU is accused of funding. Brussels denies human rights violations are occurring due to migration agreements signed with Tunisia and Libya, which see the EU pay hundreds of millions of euros to authorities preventing Mediterranean crossings. But new research presents damning evidence of atrocities arising from these partnerships. Welcome to MEELive's Deep Dive, where we dive into a story shaking up the world. Refugees and migrants across Libya and Tunisia are coordinating protests against what they call inhumane and racist treatments at the hands of EU-funded authorities. Protesters in Sfax, the site of today's attack, have spoken about innocent migrants dying in detention centres, others being driven to the desert and abandoned, and others being sold into modern slavery. Women and children among the protesters called on international actors to help them find their missing husbands and fathers.
Because a lot of us, our husbands are missing, these children, their fathers are missing, we don't even know their whereabouts. The few ones that are able to call us, they let us know that they are in Libya prison and some are in Algeria desert. They can't even find their way here. We can't hear from majority of them, which is why we're going to plead to the IOM, the UN, the authorities to please stop selling us to the Libyans, to please stop taking us to Algeria desert.
Protesters also say, rather than deterring them from crossing into Europe, their treatment at the hands of these North African states is pressing them to continue their journeys.
The real problem that we wanted here is that when we have come here, we have nothing. First, we are suffering a lot, and the second, we have an issue. Our issue is that we would like to get out from this country. We have not any place to live.
It raises questions about the efficacy of EU border policy and also the humanity. This week marks 10 years since refugee sea crossings into Europe surged and operations by SOS Humanity, an NGO in the Mediterranean, began. These threw immigration into the political limelight. Now, a decade on, SOS Humanity has released a report detailing EU complicity in atrocities committed by third-party authorities. These include the Libyan and Tunisian coast guards. It also traces EU taxpayer funds falling into the hands of the very traffickers these policies claim to combat. The report, titled Borders of Inhumanity, is based on the testimonies of 64 survivors from 15 countries who were rescued by the Humanity ship over a 3-year period. MEE has footage from one interview with a 28-year-old man from South Sudan, featured in the report under the pseudonym Stephen. Stephen came to Libya after a factory injury in Egypt made it impossible for him to work, and he had no access there to medical treatment. He recounts his and his fellow travellers' experiences reaching Europe, first at the mercy of gangs in the Sahara Desert who hold migrants hostage and extort their families, and then at the hands of EU-funded Libyan authorities, where he recounts detention, starvation, forced labour and beatings.
I'm a refugee, I'm an asylum seeker. This one is a very painful story for my brothers who are willing to come to Libya. This one is very hard because you may face many things. Your life in that it is not safe. If they never kill you, they can even make all your family poor. They can catch you, tell you call your family. If you not call your family, they will just cut some of your body, they will burn you, so that and video you and send the video to your family. So your family, if they don't have anything, they will sell the land, the house, so they can save your life. We need only safety. In Libya, there is no safety. There is no safety for any migrant or anyone. I go to Tripoli, the capital of Libya. I register for UNHCR asylum. So that was on October. The police, they come, they attack the UNHCR asylum that time. So they catch many people. You have UNHCR document, you don't have document. They catch all the foreigners, they carry them to prison. So that time I spent like 4 months in prison. This prison is called Enzara. I entered the sea in the 2 of June 2022. They catch me. From that day, I stay inside the prison, Melita, 3 months. The situation was very bad inside Melita prison. There is no water and also there is no feeding. So life is very worse. Everything is difficult. So I face the difficulty inside that prison because I didn't have anyone with me in Libya. It was me only struggling, hustling, all these things. I work in the barrack, soldiers barrack. I work for 8 months. These 8 months, no rest, no Friday, no Sunday. From morning, sometimes from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. working. With this hand, I carry block, I carry cement. And after that, we clean the house, the rooms for the soldiers. We clean toilet rooms, we sweep the ground, doing all the work. Washing even their cars. There's everything inside the barrack. We are the machine. They use us like this. So if you mistake, you speak wrong or you do something, they go beat you. Everything is like you are not human. I lose my dream, I lose hope, I lose everything. But last night you give me another life, you give me another hope. So I will thank humanity, one rescue crew.
Stephen's despair ended, he says, when he was rescued in the Mediterranean by SOS Humanity, the rescue group behind today's research. A warning, the next interview may involve reference to sexual violence, which makes up part of the findings. Here to discuss those findings is SOS Humanity's Sasha Okenden. Hello, Sasha.
Hi, good afternoon.
The report says that it brings to light the consequences of the European Union's externalization policies. Can you just explain what is meant by externalization and which specific policies you're talking about?
Absolutely. So externalization refers to the outsourcing of border controls and international protection to so-called third countries. In other words, rather than dealing with people as they arrive in Europe, it means pushing back that responsibility onto countries outside the European Union. So in this case, Libya and Tunisia. So we've looked at the EU funding over the last 10 years, which is about 242 million euros just on so-called border control or border protection. What that means is the EU is doing everything it can to either prevent people leaving those countries or to force them back to those countries in order to avoid having to fulfill their responsibilities under international law. And those responsibilities, by the way, they stem from the Geneva Convention of 1951. They're a product of the Second World War. But despite this fact, the EU is putting money and resources into funding so-called Libyan Coast Guard and Tunisian Coast Guard. They've supported the creation of rescue coordination centres and search and rescue zones. None of these have anything to do with search and rescue. They don't have anything to do with saving lives. They're about forcing people back into the situations from which they've fled, despite the fact that that's a violation of international law. So the reason we wanted to write this report, Borders of Inhumanity, which I've got here, was to try and bring the EU to account and to try and shed light on the fact that EU taxpayer money is being used to not only violate international law, but in some cases, actually, that money is ending up financing indirectly the very smugglers that Europe is allegedly trying to combat.
Now, these externalization externalization policies you describe appear not just to be increasingly relied on by the EU, but other global north wealthy countries that are contracting poorer states to prevent asylum seekers from reaching their borders. A high-profile example, of course, is the US, which has begun deporting so-called illegal migrants to an El Salvadorian prison without due process. They're also currently seeking to deport men from Vietnam, Cuba, and Mexico to South Sudan, a country on the brink of civil war itself. And earlier this month, the UK government announced negotiations with third-party countries about receiving rejected UK asylum seekers. Policymakers say that the goal of this is to deter people from taking dangerous journeys and stop illegal trafficking. Based on your evidence, are these policies working?
Well, I think the thing that's very clear is it's not about departures, it's about arrivals. So what the EU is trying to do is prevent people arriving, and there's some evidence that that has worked. The number of people arriving in Italy, for example, has reduced slightly. But the question for us is, at what cost? I mean, nearly 2,000 people last year died crossing the central Mediterranean. It is, according to the International Organization for Migration, IOM, it's the deadliest refugee route in the world. So what the EU is doing is not preventing people, is preventing people arriving, and the ways in which that happens can be, for example, a high number of deaths at sea. It can be people being forced back into a cycle of violence in Libya and Tunisia. So the question for us as SOS Humanity is, what is the cost of preventing people arriving? At the moment, it seems like the price that the European Union is willing to pay is actually deaths at sea. We've seen more and more people dying, more children dying as well. And even those who haven't lost their lives in the Mediterranean have been forced back to North Africa, to Libya and Tunisia. Excuse me. And the other thing I would say maybe about the rhetoric of combating traffickers and smugglers, Italy, for example, has come out very strongly and said that the Meloni government is strongly opposed to human trafficking and people smuggling. There's a case mentioned in our report earlier this year where a human trafficker who's wanted for crimes against humanity, there's an ICC warrant out against him called Osama Njim. He was able to travel freely to Italy to watch a football match. He was briefly detained and then released by the Italian government, and he was actually put on a plane back to Libya. So that is the kind of treatment that people traffickers and people smugglers get from European member states such as Libya. Some of these people are receiving money from migrants and refugees with one hand to put them on boats, and they're receiving money from the European Union from the other hand to force them back. So it's a very profitable cycle, but it's ultimately a cycle that comes at the expense of those who are trying to flee from war, from persecution, from abject poverty, and it results, in many cases, ultimately in their death.
What are the worst offences that we've seen coming out of the EU's partnership with Libya and Tunisia, both within those countries and on the Mediterranean Sea itself?
So as you mentioned in our report, we look at the testimonies of 64 survivors, some of them extremely harrowing, I have to say. The types of offences that were reported ranged from discrimination, persecution in everyday life, through to violence of many kinds, including sexual violence, rape. Many people we spoke to were imprisoned, especially in Libya, in detention centres and extorted for money. What that means is they're repeatedly tortured, and their families are forced to give what little money they have. As mentioned in the testimony that you showed earlier, that there's also a growing trend of so-called desert dumping, which means that people, when they can't pay, are simply brought to the desert and left to die. That's something that we've had testimonies where people have seen that happen to other people. We've had all of these things witnessed firsthand. I myself was on board our rescue ship Humanity 1 a couple of years ago, so a few of these interviews I carried out myself. One story that stays in my mind particularly was a man who we gave the pseudonym of Dempsey to. He was a man from the Ivory Coast. He was a professional footballer. He moved to Tunisia and actually tried to create a life there. He wasn't intending to cross the Mediterranean. But the situation for people from sub-Saharan Africa and Tunisia had escalated so dramatically that one day he was out at football training, his wife was pregnant, and a group of men broke into their house, a group of strangers, and beat her. So that she was bleeding. She went to hospital, again because of the discrimination against black migrants and refugees. They refused treatment. They refused support from the police. The police actually chased them to the coast. So they were left with no alternative but to find a boat and to cross the Mediterranean. And their story was absolutely harrowing. I mean, I wasn't able to actually speak to his wife, his pregnant wife. She'd just taken a pregnancy test that came back negative. In other words, she lost her baby due to the beating that she'd received in Tunisia. And this is the kind of situation that people are being forced back into, totally arbitrary violence, resulting in traumatic loss of life or harrowing situations.
How were researchers
And sorry,
able
you also
to...
asked a question about the...
Sorry, I just wanted to establish quickly how you're able to prove that there is a connection between EU funding, EU taxpayer money, and these human rights abuses. What is the proof?
Well, the proof on one level is no secret. I mean, the fact that the EU is funding the Tunisian Coast Guard, the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, I mean, this is publicly available information. The evidence that we're seeing, both the first-hand testimonies from survivors and from other reports from organizations working in the region, underscores what kind of organizations these are. These organizations, in some cases, actually have an overlap with the militias and with the people traffickers in Libya and Tunisia. The UN fact-finding mission of 2023 actually exposed this fact. This is relatively well known. And aside from, as I mentioned before, the phenomenon of illegally forcing people back to Tunisia and to Libya, in itself a violation of the non-refoulement principle in international law. Some of the testimonies that we heard from survivors actually underscore the fact that these are essentially violent militias. We had testimonies where people, some of whom I spoke to, they reported being beaten, being sexually harassed, actually on the sea in the central Mediterranean by these so-called coast guards. We've seen them firing live ammunition near rescue boats. We've seen them firing shots into the water. There was one case I mentioned in this report where a lady called Fida was crossing for the 8th time. She tried 8 times to flee across the Mediterranean with several children, one of them disabled. Not only was her disabled child beaten by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, but she also watched people being left to drown. So these are reports that we're hearing not in an isolated way. These are the norm. The reports, the 64 testimonies in this report, are themselves valuable evidence to show that this is something that's happening systemically. People are being beaten. There's cases where boats are rammed by the Tunisian Coast Guard, and as I say, people are literally being left to drown by an organization which is supposedly there to carry out search and rescue. So I don't think there's any secret that this is happening. It's just a case of the European Union and European governments preferring to finance these organizations rather than take responsibility for human rights and international protection.
Sasha, SOS Humanity has been operating for 10 years now in the Mediterranean. In that time, we have seen refugee migration increasingly criminalized across Europe. We've also seen humanitarian groups increasingly criminalized. Can you outline what that looks like and how that affects rescue efforts at sea?
As you mentioned, we've been operating for 10 years now. This report marks 10 years of our work. In that time, we rescued nearly 39,000 people from distress at sea. But what we've also been able to see in this time is the increasing criminalization of search and rescue organizations such as SOS Humanity. That comes in a number of forms. For example, the Italian government has a practice of assigning extremely distant ports for the disembarkation of survivors. So what that means is we'll carry out a rescue and then have to sail thousands of kilometers, sometimes 4 or 5 days, with people on board in sometimes catastrophic medical conditions before we're allowed to disembark them. That's also a way of keeping the rescue ships out of the search and rescue zone. So that's one way in which our work is is restricted. There's also increasingly been a campaign, especially by the Italian government, to detain rescue ships under spurious pretenses. There have been fines, there have been attempts to stop the rescue ships from leaving. Despite the fact that every legal attempt, every accusation made against organizations like SOS Humanity has been shown to be entirely hollow. There's never been any suggestion of any malpractice or of breaking any law. But these ships are often preemptively detained by the government, and in that time, obviously, more and more people lose their lives. More people drown in the Mediterranean, and I think that's symptomatic of a broader trend across Europe, where we see on land and on sea rescues of many kinds being criminalized, sometimes in an attempt to scare people away, in an attempt to stop people carrying out the work that they do. We see it as our duty to carry out search and rescue in the Mediterranean. There's no one else doing it. There's no state authority carrying out search and rescue. So we're not being scared away by these efforts, but at the same time, it does make our work increasingly hard carrying out as we do rescue operations in the central Mediterranean.
Nevertheless, something undoubtedly does need to be done about the deadly and unregulated migration flows that are currently happening. If it is not this, if it's not contracting third-party states to prevent these journeys from happening in the first place, what alternative solutions do groups like yours propose to mitigate the crisis?
Well, as you say, externalization for us, it sounds like a kind of a bureaucratic term. What it means in practice is simply sacrificing more lives in order to avoid processing more asylum claims, in order to avoid more people arriving in Europe. So that for us is not a solution. We've seen the effects of that in this report, Borders of Inhumanity. We've seen that externalization simply means more deaths, either in the central Mediterranean or in Libya and Tunisia. You mentioned unregulated. I think it's important to note that in the 10 years that we've been operating in the central Mediterranean, we and other organizations have always campaigned for an EU-funded, EU-coordinated search and rescue mission. That briefly existed in 2013, 2014. The Italian government carried out a limited search and rescue operation called Mare Nostrum, which proves that it can be done. It's purely a question of political will. So part of the solution from our point of view is for the EU to establish a search and rescue mission in the central Mediterranean, and actually to carry out this work that is currently falling onto the shoulders of small NGOs like SOS Humanity. That for us is a crucial part of the puzzle that needs to be solved. At the same time, we also call on the European Union and its member states to end all cooperation with Libya and with Tunisia and with authorities in those countries. That leads to the human rights violations that we've seen. That leads to people being forced back into a cycle of violence from which, unfortunately, many don't escape. And we're talking here. It's maybe important to say about the numbers that we have and the people that we have talked to. The actual number of people who've drowned in the Mediterranean is likely far higher. The number of people who've been subject to these human rights violations in Libya and Tunisia is also far higher because there's nobody there to witness them. So we see it as part of our duty. These interviews are carried out on board the Humanity One in the middle of rescue operations. But we see it as part of our duty to testify about what's happening, because in some cases these people are describing events that actually nobody else has seen and nobody's going to know about unless we try and amplify them. So that was the aim of our report, and we hope that in the long term it will lead to some of these changes to a search and rescue program in the Mediterranean, and to an end to this kind of cooperation which sees EU taxpayer money being used to essentially fund and finance human rights violations and people trafficking.
Sasha Okinden, SOS Humanity, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
In October, the EU held a migration summit in which they agreed to expand these externalizing migration policies, including for the first time funding offshore deportation centres, which they called return hubs. Earlier this month, Keir Starmer repeated that term as a policy the UK is also working towards. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, presented the policy as a bid to tackle human trafficking.
Today, we see that all those who have no right to stay in the European Union, only 20% of those who have a return decision really are returned to their countries of origin. So we're working to improve this operational work, and We will soon present a new proposal, legislative proposal for that. We had one from 2018, but it is stuck in Parliament and Council, so we will come with a new proposal for returns. We also need to continue, and we've discussed that here in this room a lot, to tackle the smuggling and the human trafficking. Here the legislation is 20 years old. So we have now a new proposal on the table, and I hope we can advance swiftly on that one.